Welcome to Because the Beatles, the podcast about the Beatles, everything about the Beatles 24/8. I'm Erica.
And I'm Allison. And before we start, be sure to subscribe on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts or stream us on Spotify. And if you're enjoying Because the Beatles, feel free to leave us a preferably 5-star review so other Beatlemaniacs can find us.
Also, don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We'll be posting videos, photos, and more from this episode and beyond. And you can also email us at bcthebeatles@gmail.com.
Yes, that is so right.
So, how's it going?
Oh my God, it's going well. We took a nice long break. September was crazy for us. So it's nice to be back. Funny content note, we're both in Brooklyn right now. We're not together, but we're both in the same borough.
Yeah, still recording in separate places, but we will be able to see each other in a couple of days. So we'll get more pictures together, which is always fun.
Yeah. Maybe we'll do something. We'll go live somewhere, Facebook or Instagram or something, and hang out with you guys a little bit. But yeah, so excited. I haven't been back to Brooklyn, I think, since the White Album Symposium.
Oh, awesome.
Last year. Yeah. So yay. I'm so happy to be back.
Welcome back.
So how's everything going with you, Erica? You had a big day this week.
I did.
Yeah, your birthday.
That's right. Yes, it was my birthday. We went to see Moulin Rouge the musical, which is the musical version of my favorite movie of all time, which I know is weird, but I fucking love Moulin Rouge, and the musical is just gorgeous. So it was awesome.
Did your puppers get you anything for your birthday?
They just got me their undying love and lots of poop.
And I'm sure some, eating walls.
We're better at that now. When Rusty was a puppy, when my bulldog was a puppy, he used to eat drywall. And he ruined a lot of things. But now he's a dapper young man of 2.5, and he's very gentle and sweet, and he just likes to hang out on the couch and not eat things he shouldn't.
Aww.
Yeah, he's a good boy.
Well, gosh, should we get into Beatle banter? Because I am very excited for what you're going to talk about.
Well, we took a little time off during the month, so this isn't quite as up to date, but I am going to talk about the September airing of Paul McCartney on The Colbert Show.
Oh my God, I'm so excited. Finally to hear you talk about this.
Finally. Now, this was aired in late September. It was a promo for his book, Hey Granddude, for the most part. But it ended up being the majority of the episode where the two of them were talking, I think about 45 minutes of the episode. I was lucky enough to have actually been at the taping of that show. 8 feet from Paul McCartney.
Oh my God.
8 feet from fucking Paul McCartney. Now, I got very lucky on this because my fiance's brother is a producer and writer on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. The episode was taped back in July with plans to use for some time in the fall when they had need for a filler episode, which they did because they were going to the Emmys that night, so that's when they put it on. So it was actually done in July. With about less than a week's notice, he texted us and was like, hey, so Paul McCartney's going to be on. What should I ask him? What is he doing these days? So didn't even really know what the deal was, why he was on. And we figured out that it was for Hey Granddude, which wasn't out yet. They were going to use it in September. They already knew, so they set it up as a promo. So got to go. It was the most incredible thing to be there in the Ed Sullivan Theater, watching Paul McCartney. Real. The best part about it, this was not a plant. There's a part before the show starts where Stephen comes out and you can ask him some questions. And some guy in the back yelled out, where in the stage did the Beatles perform? Nobody in the audience knew Paul was going to be there. It was a surprise. So Stephen's answer was, if I've got a Beatle on, I'll let you know.
LOL.
Yeah. So he did. And then when he came out, the first question that he asked Paul was like, where were you performing? Where was it on the stage? And of course, Paul had no fucking idea. Of course not.
Paul, it's funny because I feel like Paul gives so fewer fucks than any Beatles fan about any of this stuff. And it drives fans insane, just crazy. It's like, why can't you remember?
It does, and I'll get to that. Yeah. The interview is actually longer than you saw. Obviously, they did do some editing, but I think most of the good parts were left in. There was a opening bit with a woman dressed up as kind of like a 60-year-old fan still in the stands waiting for her mother to pick her up from 1964. I can totally tell it would have been hilarious in the writer's room, but Paul didn't really get it, and we didn't really get it. So
Paul didn't get it.
No, Paul was kind of looking up like, okay, like, because you couldn't actually tell totally when you first looked at her, because she was definitely an older person, but she was dressed up like a kid and from way, way, way back in the stands, like you couldn't see totally.
Yeah, maybe put her closer or had her more like beetled out.
It really seemed clear that they did not let Paul know that was happening in advance.
Oh shit, awkward.
So it didn't end up making it, but it was kind of fun to see how the show was working and all of the little cuts that they did. And Paul was so good. He was such a good sport. He was smiling. He was laughing. He was having such a good time.
Oh, he loves Stephen Colbert, though.
He does. Actually, they had a really nice moment back in 2013 when he was on the Colbert Report.
Yes.
What happened that day was that Colbert, in the middle of the taping of the show, got a message that his mother had passed away. And he had actually never met Paul McCartney before. But this happened, and Paul was in the show, and he left. Stephen left, and Paul basically just took over. He's like, it's my show now, and, you can find the tape, and it's funny. But he did that for Stephen, and so I think the two of them, while they don't know each other very well, that was a moment that connected them, and it was really sweet.
So sweet. It's so sweet to know the backstory, because I still remember that happening and being like, oh, that's so cool that he got to do that, but knowing that he was taking over for Stephen, who just lost his mom. It's just like so dear, It shows what a compassionate person Paul is.
Yeah, it was so sweet. And my fiance actually met him that day and got to talk to him. I'm jealous. He did ask him a good question. He did better than I ever would. He asked him about his bass playing and like what he's up to now. And Paul actually told him it was when he was just putting Mr. Kite into his set list and that he was nervous about playing the bass part because he had never really done it before and he was just getting used to it.
Oh my God. I really wish Luke would have said like, yeah, maybe leave that one out. Not my favorite moment in Paul shows, but to each his own.
It didn't last that long.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
Was replaced by what? Altogether now? I don't know.
But we can talk about that later.
Yes. Paul did not sing, but he was there. He was funny. He was sharp. He was looking great. Gorgeous suit. Nice.
Silver fox.
So the show aired 2 months after. But when that happened, and this is where I want to rant. When it showed up, the reaction from Beatles fans, or at least many of the Beatles fans, and not all, but many people that I saw on social media, was really fucking negative. Like, oh, that was softball questions. Why did he tell that yesterday in his dream story again? He must have like goons behind him that forced them to ask these questions. He must have a list they give him because he wants to tell that story, all this stuff.
Oh my God. People give him way too much credit.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
I was actually commenting back to some of these people like, no, I know a little bit about how it was going down. They only had about a week to do it. It was actually fairly organic. There were some good moments in there that seemed surprising. There was the bit with the opening bit that he definitely seemed caught off guard for and all this. And a couple of people online tried to school me for being so naive that why would I think that there wouldn't be a pre-interview, which I never said that. Obviously, there was a pre-interview. And B, how dare an interviewer not ask the hard-hitting questions of Paul? One of the examples that I got was, what if he had come out and said and asked Paul how he felt when John Lennon was yelling homophobic slurs at Brian? How did he feel about that? Or how did he feel about Yoko? Like, I don't want...
Sorry, I'm just picturing Paul coming out and that being Colbert's first question to him. That makes me cry laughing. Like,
right?
So Paul, how did it make you feel 50 years ago when John Lennon said homophobic shit to Brian? Oh my God, I just cannot. In what world do these people live?
Right? For one thing, that would be so offensive on a promo spot on a late show for a kid's book.
Yeah, that makes it even funnier. Like, that's the kind of question he would get if like he and I were drunk together and it was like 3 o'clock in the morning and I was like blackout, I'd be like, Paul,
Right.
tell me how you felt when John said XYZ. But like, not, Stephen Colbert's not going to ask that.
And Paul wouldn't remember. Do you remember things from even 10 or 15 years ago that like didn't stand out in your memory back then?
No, I mean, Paul is so quote unquote selective in his memory.
Yes,
I'm sure
he
he
is.
wouldn't address it. I mean, anyway.
Right. And I mean, I leave that to people like Mark Lewison to find out things like that using primary source material. Paul is not the person for that. And expecting more from him than what you're going to get, I mean, I think that it does both Paul and the fans a disservice. What we did get in this interview was some really nice emotional moments between Paul and Steven. And Steven is a fanboy. He really is,
I love that.
He's not like hardcore like us. He's more middle of the road. And hearing the story about yesterday, not everybody has heard it. Everybody in our circle has heard it.
We're probably not talking to you if you're listening to this, but we all have seen it go down on Facebook or Twitter or whatever. But, we're a very select group. We're like kind of the 1% of Beatles fans. Like the majority of the world, like I think about my family, I think about casual Beatle friends, like they don't know the scrambled egg story. They don't know like all this stuff that we can recite off the top of our heads. And we sort of are like, oh, this old trick again. We're such a minority in this and we don't recognize that enough.
Right. And I don't fault anybody for not wanting to watch an interview like that. But expecting him to come out with something profound or scandalous or some new bit of information does a disservice to the part that actually was new, which he talked about a lot of emotional things. Like he talked about the difference between Paul, the persona, and Paul, the guy who likes to watch TV at night.
That's awesome.
He talked about that, and he talked about feeling like everyone hated him after the Beatles breakup. Mm-hmm. And he talked about how he feels about his friendship with John. Like, those were great.
Yeah.
There were some lovely things in there, and I was just disappointed to see vitriol about the interview that missed some of those really actually special things. I mean, he's in his late 70s now. He's not going to give us any new information, any new scandals, but those insights on his personality and character for somebody who is traditionally not the kind of person to really talk about emotions. I mean, he's very like stiff upper lip in that way. That's new and that's nice to see.
I mean, this is the guy who right after John was killed said it's a drag, and of course he was in shock, but like that's how he's always kind of been with his emotions. And you're right, Erica. It's wrong of us to sort of overlook these things. I think about Carpool Karaoke, where James Corden mentions his grandfather, and they had that really lovely moment in the car. And I was like in tears, like, and so even those little moments, like, yeah, the rest of the Carpool Karaoke was kind of stuff that we all knew, and it was cool to see Liverpool, but it's, but you miss those moments. And, this is why we can't have nice things sometimes in the Beatles fandom. It's like, guys, come on, like, do we really have to fucking nitpick every single part of this? Like, you're right. Paul's in his late 70s. We're not going to do anything new. Cherish these fucking moments. I'm not going to go into it, but it's just like, have fun with it a little bit, I don't know. I get sick of this crap.
One of our listeners, Leah, if you're out there, she mentioned...
She's awesome.
I know, she's so cool. She mentioned that she went on some of the Colbert site where there were comments and the social media for that. And the comments were like 100% positive and excited about it. Nobody was saying, oh God, that old story.
That's the point. Like, and that's really important to remember, that bit of levity where it's like, yeah, you are preaching to the choir when you go on like Beatles groups on Facebook, but like the people who actually watch Colbert are more casual fans and they thought that was cool. So there you go.
There you go. So that's my Beatles banter. And if you haven't seen the interview, check it out. It's online. It's really good.
Yeah, he's sweet.
They're sweet together. You can tell that they have a connection. Actually, if you like Colbert, he told a pretty touching moment himself about how Band on the Run, he connects it to a very special time in his own life. So it was a nice exchange of stories.
That's so sweet. Yeah, it's such a good interview. I'm so jealous you were there. I'm so glad you were there because you got to tell us about it.
It was amazing. The only thing that I regret is the camera angle that you see Paul at was exactly the view that I had for most of the time. So for part of the time, I did have a cameraman's butt in my face. And I was in the second to the aisle seat, and I was literally like leaning over Luke, like with my head in the aisle for part of it, like trying to get like the best angle so I could see Paul until I moved the camera. It was worth it.
Well, at least you're breathing the same air as Paul.
Oh.
As crazy as that just made me sound.
Whatever. You didn't think I didn't think that?
There you go. I mean, there's virtue in that. I love it. I don't have much Beatle banter, except I don't know why it's left to me to talk about this. Okay, so yeah, Ringo came out with a new album last week on Friday. And we decided that we're going to do a review episode, of course. Like, I feel kind of bad because we did a whole, like midnight release episode for Egypt Station. But we will talk about Ringo's album, What's My Name?
We are not neglecting it. It will come soon.
It's purely because we've both been busy. And we were just kind of burnt out after last month. So
yeah, Beatles at the Ridge is fabulous. And Abbey
Yes.
Road is fabulous. But I think we just needed a bit of a break to get back into real lives.
His cover of Grow Old With Me
Oh my God.
is apparently singled out, and a lot of people have been talking about it. I will save it for the episode. I don't want to go down that road if I can't fully walk and strut my stuff.
This will not be a Ringo bashing session.
No. I want to correct my reputation for being a Ringo hater. Like, Ringo is not my favorite Beatle. It's true. It's not about him being a Beatle. I think I've ranted about this before, my issues with Ringo. Nothing to do with him as a Beatle, nothing to do with him as a drummer, any of that. So talking about his albums, that'll be great. Today is Halloween, so we thought we'd bring back something that we did back in spring, I think, which is do some Beatles true crime talking.
And today's episode features the mysterious case of Jimmie Nicol, the session drummer who filled in on the Beatles' 1964 tour when Ringo was out sick.
This may not be as quote-unquote true crimey as some of our other topics, but it is very mysterious. His life after the Beatles run is kind of a blank page. Like, we don't really know what happened to Jimmie Nicol. It's very intriguing. He traveled around the globe. There's been rumors that he's dead. Like, I mean, what is the truth, Oprah GIF? What is it?
And to find out the truth and to learn more, we go through this story with our friend, author Jim Berkenstadt, otherwise known as the Rock and Roll Detective.
We love Jim. He's great.
Jim is a writer, a researcher, and a consultant. He goes in depth on pop music history and investigates some of music's most interesting mysteries. He's worked as a consultant to the Beatles and to George Harrison's family. Most notably, he was the consultant for the film Living in the Material World, that Scorsese film. He's worked with the Traveling Wilburys, the band Garbage, the families of Roy Orbison and Buddy Holly, and that's just to name a few. And he recently came out with a book that's a New York Times bestseller called The Beatle Who Vanished. It uncovers the true story of Beatles drummer Jimmie Nicol, who briefly took over for Ringo Starr before vanishing.
And yeah, we actually sat down with Jim last month at the lovely Beatles at the Ridge Festival, and that live show is coming shortly. And we discussed the mysterious and spooky story of Jimmie Nicol, the Beatle Who Vanished.
It's fascinating. Jim is hilarious. He knows his shit. Oh
so
my God.
fucking funny. Talking to him was just a delight. But there was one thing he did, Erica, that kind of bothered me.
What was that, Allison?
So this is kind of a theme of Beatles at the Ridge, and I don't mind saying that I became sort of the tent pole of propriety when it came to how to pronounce Brian's name. And, it got so that some of the presenters and authors would shoot me a look when they said Brian Epstein, and I would give them a nod. So when we sat down to interview Jim, he started throwing out all these expletives, Epstein, Epstein, Epstein. And I was just like, oh, shit, I can't handle this. So I had to stop him. And I said, Jim, I have to tell you, it's not Epstein, it's Epstein. And we got into like a nice little conversation. Jim is very gracious. He's probably listening right now. And Jim, love you. You're wonderful. So he has righted his ways. But we decided that if one of our guests happens to mispronounce Brian Epstein's last name, it's going to be censored from now on.
Just like any other curse word.
You can say fuck all day long, but you can't say because that is not appropriate.
And that's what it's going to sound like. You'll hear
Yes.
that throughout. We're leading the culture change, people.
Got to be the change you want to see in the world. And I want to see this change in the world. Anyway, so without further ado, let's get into it with Jim. So we are currently sitting here at Beatles at the Ridge in Walnut Ridge, Arkansas. We have with us Jim Berkenstadt, aka the Rock and Roll Detective. Jim has written an amazing book about somebody that you might know the name of, but more so you might know the legend of Jimmie Nicol, the Beatle Who Vanished. Jim, welcome to Because the Beatles. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thanks for having me on, first of all. I guess I started out as a Beatle fan the night they were on the Ed Sullivan Show.
Yeah.
My mom had showed me a picture of them on the front page of the Chicago Tribune, and they were having a pillow fight on a bed in a hotel room. So I thought they were like Laurel and Hardy or the Marx Brothers. So I was like really shocked when they came on Ed Sullivan and they were like playing loud rock and roll, and I was like, oh, this is way better than a pillow fight.
Shout out to your mom for introducing you to the Beatles.
Oh, right? She totally did. Yeah, and then she like ran out in a week, I think, and bought me the first album. So.
Oh my God, best mom ever.
Yeah. From then on, I was hooked. You know, I basically was one of those geeks that instead of looking at the back of baseball cards, I was reading the liner notes and the credits on Beatle albums and singles and such. So I just became fascinated in that. And then every article that came out, we didn't have the internet then. So back in the covered wagon days, you know, you had to wait for you had to go to a movie on the weekend to see a newsreel that showed a little clip of the Beatles getting on or off an airplane and the fans screaming. It was a little harder then to gather information, but I kept doing it. And then around the late 60s when the Beatles, at the end of the 60s when the Beatles broke up, like spring of 70, I was at a real loss because that was my band. I didn't know they'd have a whole solo career, but they just weren't going to be making Beatle records. So suddenly I was maybe 14 or 15, and I went downtown in Chicago and found this sort of kind of the Haight-Ashbury section of Chicago. And
where was that?
It was it's where Second City is now.
Oh, okay. So like downtown proper.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
And I went into this store, and it was like it was like the Marshall Fields of head shops. Just a gigantic,
because Marshall Fields is also on the Millennium Mile up there.
Right. So I went in there, and I was like, wow, what a cool, hippie store. And there's all these black light posters of Hendrix and Jim Morrison and all this. But then I saw these albums on the wall. I walked over to them, and they were the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and Bob Dylan. But they all had like white covers with sort of mimeographed artwork on the front. And I'm like, what are these records? And the guy said, oh, these are bootlegs. So I said, oh, what's that? And he explained things that hadn't been released and were now being illegally pressed onto vinyl. And I said, well, what's the coolest Beatle bootleg? And he pulled down this one of the Beatles. It was actually unreleased audio from the Let It Be movie of the Beatles rehearsing, chatting, laughing, talking. And I just became addicted to Beatle bootlegs at that point. And it helped fill the gap of the fact that the Beatles were gone. And then live concerts started to leak out. So I really built quite a huge archive of unreleased material, and then wrote a book called that's this one. I wrote a book called Black Market Beatles in the early 90s, which I later learned that Neil Aspinall, the Beatles, had a copy that they referred to when they were working on the anthology. And then in 1998, I heard George Harrison was working on All Things Must Pass to create a new remastered version, and I had all types of demos and outtakes and alternate takes, and I contacted his people, and next thing you know, I'm doing research for George Harrison.
It's amazing. I would kill. That's awesome.
It was the greatest experience of my life, really. And then when George passed away, right before he passed away, he told Paul, Ringo, and Yoko about me and Neil and said, you guys ought to get a hold of this guy. He's in Madison, Wisconsin.
That was his last words.
Yeah.
And his last words were, Get Jimmie Berkenstadt.
And look, forget love one another. Screw
No,
that.
that was CNN just made that up. It's fake news.
He wasn't quite on his deathbed yet, but he was a few months away. And he said, this guy knows more about our unreleased tracks than we do or something. And so Ringo said, where's Madison, Wisconsin? And Paul said, it doesn't matter.
I don't know which one's better.
How Ringo and how Paul are those two statements? You can kind of encapsulate
something like that. So anyway,
it doesn't matter.
maybe a few months after George passed, then Neil Aspinall hired me to do work for Apple, and so I've just been doing all this research, and of course I've also been writing books along the way. After Black Market Beatles, I wrote Nevermind Nirvana about the making of Nirvana's album
awesome.
in the 90s, and then the most recent is The Beatle Who Vanished.
As the rock and roll detective, it seems like you really like to delve into these little-known mysteries and bring them out into light. And your most recent book, The Beatle Who Vanished, was about a very interesting Beatles story, the story of Jimmie Nicol. So can you tell us a little bit about who Jimmie Nicol was and why he's important to the Beatles story?
Sure. Just on the eve of the Beatles' first ever world tour, they were taking a photo shoot, and all of a sudden Ringo passed out.
And this is 64,
Yeah,
right? Right.
It was like June 3rd, 1964. The next day is their first ever world tour, and Ringo goes into the hospital. And in those days, there's no insurance, there's no out clauses in these contracts, so they had to go back on the road, and they had to do this tour, or they would have been sued by all the promoters for the lost ticket sales that had to be refunded. They would have had to refund a lot of stores where they were selling all this Beatle merchandise. All the EMI had singles ready to come out in all these countries. It just would have been a mess, and it really took Brian Epstein a full year to organize a world tour. You know, I think if it had been John or Paul, it might have been very difficult for the show to go on without them.
Right.
But because it was a drummer who only sang one song, I think they felt we can do this. So just over George Harrison's objections, they went out looking for a drummer, and the first two drummers they asked turned them down.
Who were the first two drummers?
One was Ray Duvall, and he had his own club, and he had his own band in the club, and he had been with a group called Emil Ford and the Checkmates, and the Beatles had seen them play in Liverpool and had been on the same bill. Talented guy.
Second one was Pete Best, right?
No. Actually, I asked Pete, in the book, I interviewed Pete, and I said, by chance, did they go back and ask you to come sub? And he said, I have one word answer for that. It's no.
That would open a whole
Damn, I mean, that's pretty, yeah.
Can you imagine all the
that would have hurt.
history if they
That
didn't
would have
ask
hurt.
Pete
That would have hurt. Yeah, they didn't even ask him.
And
Anyway.
the other guy's name was Graham. I can't remember his first name offhand, but he was a very famous session drummer at the time, and he had played drums on the Kinks albums and other big pop bands of that day, where you didn't realize it, but the drummer you'd see on tour just actually never would play on the album because he wasn't good enough in the studio. So that guy said, you know, if you miss 2 weeks of session work, which was very, very lucrative at the time, the guy who organized the sessions would penalize you for 2 months. You'd be out of work.
Wow.
So he just couldn't afford to go on tour. He was too much in demand. But he suggested, there's this guy, Jimmie Nicol, why don't you go check him out? So next thing you know, Jimmy gets a phone call at home at his apartment, and George Martin asked him to come down to Abbey Road and do either a rehearsal or a tryout, depending on who you ask.
So Jimmie Nicol, obviously a drummer. He wasn't from Liverpool, right? Or was he from London?
He was from London, yeah. He was just known around the scene amongst artists, but he was completely, really invisible to the public at the time.
Right.
And considering this was a Beatles world tour and it was John, Paul, George, and Ringo, what were some of the things that Brian was looking for in a drummer to replace Ringo during this time? Were they trying to conceal that it was a different person?
That's a great question. I think Epstein himself wanted to cover up the fact or pass off another drummer, in this case Jimmie Nicol, as Ringo Starr so that people wouldn't even take notice. And I think the reason I believe that is because he had Nicol wear Ringo Starr's suits. He had He had him using Ringo's drum kit. He sent a hairdresser over to Jimmie Nicol's house that night and had her do a little bit more work on his already growing Beatle haircut so that he looked like the rest of them. And of course, he would be the farthest person back on stage. And in talking to various fans who were at some of these shows, they had no idea when they went to these concerts in Denmark and Adelaide, they had no idea that it was not Ringo Starr. They thought they were seeing the complete Beatles, and all the posters still had Ringo's face on them. The ticket stubs had Ringo. I think from Epstein's perspective, they were trying to pass him off. But what's interesting is if you listen to some of the audio bootlegs, Paul McCartney made a point of introducing Jimmy by name. He actually said, we're sorry Ringo's ill and he's not here tonight, but we have Jimmie Nicol. And then there'd be a big cheer for Jimmy. So I thought, good on you, Paul, for pointing Jimmy out and letting him take his bow during this short time.
Maybe there was like an internal struggle because George was a hard no.
Yeah, talk about how George was
That's really interesting.
George was adamant. He was very loyal to the concept of the Beatles as John, Paul, George, and Ringo. And if you think about it, Lennon and McCartney were very close because of their writing together most of the songs. And so as a result, George was also much younger. George started to pair off with Ringo at that point in time. And Ringo being the newest member of the band, he had only come in 2 years earlier. The two of them sort of got together. So George felt very loyal to not go out on tour, because he said, it's, without Ringo, we're not the Beatles, so we shouldn't go. And basically Epstein said that you really have to go out because we have all these legal obligations and you can't let the fans down. And so everybody sort of lobbied George and he ultimately agreed to go along with it.
How many shows did Jimmie Nicol perform with the Beatles?
Let me think. Well, the first day he did a TV show. I don't know if that counts as a show. But
sure, why not?
They sort of, they actually had live mics and Jimmy played drums, but they were ironically, they were playing recorded Beatles songs and the Beatles lip synced or could sing live along with themselves. And the interesting irony is there's Jimmie Nicol playing drums along with Ringo playing drums on the recording.
Okay.
So figure that one out.
Weird start.
Yeah, but then, let's see, Denmark, a couple shows there. Then they went to Hong Kong, played a couple there. Actually, a lot of the audience was made up of British military and their kids and such. They went to Sydney, but they didn't play there. They just sort of hung out. And then when they went to Adelaide, they played either 2 or 4 shows, can't remember exactly. And some of those have been recorded. Then when they got to Melbourne, Jimmy got to be in his last press conference, and that was the only press conference where you'll see 5 Beatles, 2 drummers, all at the microphones, and that was kind of interesting.
Did Jimmy get asked any questions?
Yes, at every press conference along the way, they would usually start by asking general questions, and usually John or Paul or sometimes George would pipe in. But then they would specifically say, well, Jimmy, how's it going? And what's it like taking over for Ringo Starr? Those were some of the typical questions. And then they would say, when's Ringo coming back? And no one really knew exactly. So they would just, it's funny, one of the interviews, all 4 of them have a different answer. Oh, tomorrow. Oh, 2 days. So none of them knew.
Now, that's kind of a point in the story where the mystery begins a little bit, because your book is called The Beatle Who Vanished. Talk a little bit about what this would have been like for Jimmy to go from being in relative obscurity to being at the height of pop stardom for just 14 days.
Cannot get
days.
Bigger, yeah.
And then see you later, dude.
Right. I mean, there's a famous picture of him at the Melbourne airport where he just looks like he's been hit by a car. It's like, what have I just been through? I've gone from being a drummer that no one really knew in London. Suddenly, all these girls are ripping my clothes off and screaming for me, and I'm getting the largest crowds I've ever played in front of, and I'm with the Beatles. And then all of a sudden, now I'm back at the airport, with a gold watch and a stuffed animal and a week's wages, and I'm going back home. Yeah. And, I thought maybe they would perhaps, because I bonded with the group and because I'm a good drummer, I thought maybe since Ringo took over from someone 2 years ago, maybe I can take over 2 years later and be in the Beatles. But I think he didn't realize that the Beatles by then had really become like four brothers and were pretty close-knit. So that wasn't a possibility. So he also at that time wanted to actually fly to Sydney and hang out with this gal, Frances Faye, who was this singer who he had met in Sydney. And she had said, well, hang out with me for the rest of my time here. Then we'll fly back to the U.S. and I'd love to have you record on my next album. She was a big Capitol recording artist. And Brian Epstein said, nope, I bought you a one-way ticket. You're going back to London, and that's it. See you later.
That's crazy. I mean, you think about like the Beatles at the top of their game, and he's still being treated with a workman's salary. Yeah. As you said, a gold watch, which I guess was a gift from Brian for his services. Right. If you try to compare it to the artists of today, if somebody had filled in for a major spot for Beyonce or something, they would not be treated like that, I'm sure.
Well, and the Beatles treated him very well, I have to say. And most of the other bands on the tour, I think he got along well with everyone. It's just that once Brian came back, things got really serious again.
Like Brian brought Ringo back to us.
Right.
They flew into Australia together.
And Brian was pretty strict on these tours. But while he wasn't with them during the early part of the tour, Jimmy was able to go out at night, do whatever he wanted, or stay in and have all the girls upstairs and have the parties and such. And it's interesting because the last night, actually at the press conference, when there was 5 of them, Jimmy was sort of doing a little talking a little too loud to a reporter who had just come to the side of the table. And Brian Epstein got really mad at him. And he had Derek Taylor go over and say, cut this side talk out because you're distracting from the Beatles press conference.
Oh, wow.
And when he got up, one of the witnesses to this, who was a drummer for Sounds Incorporated, said it was really amazing. Brian came over to him, got right in his face, and just like ripped on him for being so rude at this press conference. Now, from Jimmy's perspective, it's like, this is the last time I'm going to get this world stage, and I'm being asked questions, and they had ignored me for most of the press conference. So they were like jawing at each other. And Brian said, go to your room, pack your bag, you're leaving tomorrow, and you're not going to Sydney. So that night, Jimmie Nicol snuck out while the Beatles were having yet another party with girls upstairs.
That sounds crazy.
Yeah, he goes out, and he just goes to a bar. And next thing you know, he hears these squealing tires pull up. And it's Mal Evans and Neil Aspinall.
Oh my God! He sent the boys after him.
Yeah.
He sent the muscle.
Brian sent the henchmen, and they come in and they go, "What do you think you're doing?" And he says, "What do you mean? I'm having a drink in the pub." He says, "I'm not a Beatle anymore." And they said, "You are a Beatle until we put you on that plane."
That's amazing.
So, and those were really directly from Epstein. That wasn't, Neil and Mal are great guys, but they were being told what to tell him. So they dragged him back to the hotel.
And I can imagine from Brian's perspective, he wants to keep this group as together as possible.
Right.
This was a sub. There was nothing more than a sub.
Doesn't want anything bad to happen that would affect their reputation. And again, this is their first ever world tour.
Yeah, it makes sense.
So, back to Jimmy. What happened to him after
he goes home,
was finished with this grand experience that ended in such deflation?
It did, but when he got home, he got this hero's welcome. Everybody's like, oh, the fifth Beatle, because that's how they had referred to him in the paper. And he got his record company. He had like a 3-single deal with Pi. So they really wanted to capitalize on this. And so I think his next single that came out said something like, Jimmie Nicol, Back from the Beatles or something on the label to capitalize on it. And then he put together a group made up of other session players and formed a group called Jimmie Nicol and the Shub-Dubs, which is not a real winning name. Shub-Dubs. What's that?
Kind of sounds like schlubs.
Schlubs or flubs. Yeah. So very talented people, but Jimmy thought, you know what? I've seen how this works. I've seen what it's like on the top of the entertainment mountain. I can do this. I can compete with the Beatles. So he starts getting a lot of gigs, pretty good gigs, because He's got the media still following him around for a while. It's a big story for them. Beatles are still on their world tour. They're heading off to New Zealand now. And Jimmy gets on Top of the Pops on a show that the Rolling Stones are on, so that's a lot of exposure. And then what's kind of interesting is when the Beatles get done with that leg of the tour and they come home, actually, before that happens, Dave Clark of the Dave Clark Five gets sick. And so he was a drummer. Mm-hmm. But his band can't play without Dave Clark. So they were on the top of a bill at some, week-long event. So instead, that promoter hires Jimmie Nicol and the Schlubdubs. Shubdubs to
I didn't say that.
Yeah, I know. It's so funny.
They hire him to take the place of the Dave Clark Five. So that's another big crowd. So he does that. That does well. Then actually the Beatles come back and they're doing a one of these 1 week stands or something somewhere. And Brian Epstein actually hires Jimmie Nicol's band to be on the same bill. And he gets that experience. And then Jimmy...
that was nice.
Yeah, it was very nice.
Yeah.
And then Jimmy tours around the Netherlands with the band. But eventually by December of 1964, Jimmy had thought that they were going to do so well that he could pay these guys really big money to stay with him and give up session work. So he locks into this, but what's happening is the media goes away. He's no longer in the papers every day. The crowds at these gigs he's having to go play smaller and smaller venues, get paid less and less, and he can no longer afford the band. So they break up. Then another manager type guy, the manager for the Hollies, comes along, according to Graham Nash, who I talked to, and he works with Jimmy and says, let's get you a new record deal, let's just start all over. And so Jimmy starts another band. But the problem is Jimmie Nicol's in the back. He's not singing, he's not up front.
So he's billing himself as a front man that's not even a singer.
But he's a front man in the back. Yeah, he's not even a singer. So that's not going to work, and of course it didn't. And by say April or May of 1965, that band falls apart. No one ever hears the singles. And now he's bankrupt because he spent so much on equipment and bands and people. He doesn't know how to financially manage this thing. He's bankrupt. He's unemployed. His wife then divorces him at this time. And he's really down in the dumps in the summer, 1 year later after the Beatles.
Whoa.
And Paul McCartney reads about this. And Paul comes to the rescue and calls Peter Asher and asks if Peter and Gordon could hire Jimmy and help him out. And they do. I talked to Peter and Gordon.
Oh, that's very nice.
They were like, yeah, he was really talented. We had him in the studio. Neither of them remember what songs he recorded, but they just remember he was there. And then they went on a tour. So he did a tour with them. And finally, one day, he just was like he'd had enough. And he got on an airplane and disappeared.
So by disappear, what do you mean?
I mean, he didn't tell his wife or his 5-year-old son. He didn't tell any of the people he had worked on sessions with. He had blown off Georgie Fame and the Blue Flames, who wanted him back. He basically sort of shut the door on every one of these people. And all of them who I talked to said, we never saw him again.
And this is a year after the Beatles world tour.
Right.
Wow. So he must have been in his mid-20s or so, right?
Yeah, I think he was 26 at that point. And it's like he walked out the door and none of these people ever knew what happened to him after that.
Wow.
Which made my job harder because I'm like, now...
Yeah, I know. Where do you go from there?
Where do you go from there? So I'm not sure how I found this out, but...
The magic of the internet, maybe?
I think the magic of Google. Googly Google.
Google magic.
Yeah. Where did Jimmy go next?
Right.
But I somehow discovered that he had moved on to a Swedish band and had flown to Gothenburg, and they had hired him because another drummer had to drop out, this time because his wife didn't want him to tour.
Fair.
And said, you're not going to tour. So Jimmy, was like, okay. And so they hired him as a full-time member of the band, and he recorded maybe 5 or 6 albums with the Spotniks, who were an instrumental rock band. They were similar to America's band called The Ventures.
Oh, yeah, time. Like a surf rock kind of sound. Yeah.
Although they weren't necessarily surf rock, but they were instrumental.
Right.
And they would do popular songs of the day, and as well as some of their own. And so he toured for 2 years with them. From a marketing standpoint, that band was really clever. They'd go to Berlin, and they'd record an album, and they'd call it Spotniks in Berlin, and everybody in Germany would buy that album. Then they'd go to another country and do the same thing.
That's cool, yeah.
Yeah, kind of a clever idea.
The fact that it was so much less globalization back then, it just makes things so much different in the way you market things, and the fact that a man can disappear from his life, but actually still be touring as a public person just in another country.
It's mystifying,
right.
yeah.
It is.
You know, it's not like he's left nothing. You know, people pick up and leave, but he's left a whole family. He's left jobs. Like, he's probably left paychecks on the table. It's like, it's so mystifying, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, when he left the Spotniks, I talked to their keyboardist, who was always his roommate, who told me that Jimmy turned him on to smoking pot, because they were like really clean-cut guys, these Swedish guys.
Jimmy's like, I learned this from the Beatles.
Yeah, here's how we smoke pot. And you blow it out the window in the hotel room so no one knows. That's what he told me. But he said, you know, we were in Mexico for like a 1-month stand at this really nice hotel. We'd play every night. One night, Jimmy just fell off the drum stool because he had gotten into a sort of an underground thing in Mexico, and he had gotten into some harder drugs. And he just passed out, and their manager was really strict. Like, if you had more than one beer, he'd get upset. And he just fired him, and they said, you know what? We have no idea where he went.
Wow.
So I kept, you know, I'd get so far with the research, and then all of a sudden I'd be like, now what do I do?
So he vanished multiple times.
So in your research, what were some of the different iterations of Jimmy's life that we know about?
Well, I mean, he eventually ended up in Mexico, and he did so many things there. Like he got hired by RCA as an A&R producer, and they said, we want you to discover the next Beatles.
Was he still under the name Jimmie Nicol?
Yeah.
Wow. Did he ever use a pseudonym?
No. He had different band names.
Right.
But yeah, and that's interesting. You know, he never really tried to disguise himself with a different name, although that could be what he's doing now if
right, we'll get
he's
to that.
Alive. Yeah.
Right. No, wink, wink.
But yeah, like he was an arranger. He did movie soundtracks for, you know, really far out films in Mexico. He taught there. He had a button factory. I mean, he just did all kinds of things. And then later,
what did he teach? A drum
He taught like
instructor?
Music theory and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
At the local, they had sort of a technical college in Mexico City.
And he remarried in Mexico, right?
He did. He married a woman named Julia. She is a really nice lady. It took me a year to get her to talk to me. I don't know why, but you know what the key was? One day she said, well, I was trying to convince her to talk to me. She said, where are you from? And I said, I'm from Madison, Wisconsin. And she goes, oh, well, my sister-in-law lives in Madison. Well, then you're okay. So
it's that was little connection.
This little connection. You know, if I had been from Nebraska, we'd still be waiting for her to reveal all the secrets.
It was meant to be, yeah.
But she was really interesting, and what's really interesting to me is before Jimmy ever came to Mexico, before she ever knew he existed, she was a professional dancer. And she had gone in a dance troupe to Sweden, to tour Sweden and do dancing. And the guy that was promoting the dance thing also promoted the Spotniks.
Wow.
And she said, I remember being in this promoter's office in Gothenburg, Sweden, and there on the wall was a picture of the Spotniks. And she said Jimmy was one of those people in the poster, but I didn't know him from left field.
Small world.
Isn't it?
Crazy.
I mean, back then, too, when there was no internet or anything to pull us closer.
But I'm like, so he would have had to get a divorce from his wife that he left.
Yes, and I think he did get a divorce from his wife, Patty, before he left for Sweden.
Oh, he did before. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a little quicker then, too, in those days.
So, where has Jimmy been in the last, 20 years or so?
Where's Jimmy?
Good question. Well, at one point he came back to London, where he worked as a remodeler. Like he would remodel people's homes, and some of the people I interviewed said, "Oh yeah, he redid our living room. He was very good."
That's awesome. That's so crazy to have like Jimmie Nicol redo your living room. Like
it's like, okay, we're gonna remodel now after this drum solo.
I was in the Beatles wallpapering.
Right. Well, and he really wanted to make a business of that, but also that was started in the 80s, and interestingly, this Amsterdam Beatles Holland fan club asked if he would come over to do a fan convention. It was 20 years since he'd been in the Beatles. I think it was 84. So he said, all right. So he and his son went over there. They had a real good time. They recreated the canal ride in the water.
Yeah.
They recreated, waving from the balcony. And there was a Beatle cover band there, and he sat in and played drums with them. And
wow.
You can just see from the pictures of him autographing things. And these are all pictures in the book, The Beatle Who Vanished.
Out now.
Available on Amazon.
Bestseller.
Anyway, and soon to be a major motion picture.
Which we'll get to.
We will get to. But you could see he was really happy at this thing. And I was able to find the organizer of that convention, and he said, "Oh, we made a recording of Jimmy. We interviewed him for about an hour at the convention, but we've never done anything with it." And I said, "Can you send it to me?"
Oh, wow.
I like that.
That was really interesting because in the discussion, he talked about how he was currently writing a book about his whole career.
Oh, wow.
And he says, just about ready. It never came out. But the other interesting thing was he made some statements about, I can't remember specifically what he said, but he was talking about his Beatles experience, and his son, Howie, contradicted him, and you actually hear them on the tape arguing. It's like, you weren't there, and I was there, but you told me this and that. So it's kind of interesting.
That's cool.
They weren't quite in agreement. And shortly after that, he came home, and he also was asked by Paul McCartney through talk about small world again. Howie, his son, was the sound recordist. That's the credit title they use in England. I guess that's like audio engineer for the Beatles anthology movie.
Oh, how weird is that?
So when Paul McCartney, who always was a big fan of Jimmy, when Paul heard that Howie was Jimmie Nicol's son, he went to Howie and said, "Hey, would your dad be willing to be in our movie? We'd like to cover him during the first part of the world tour." And he asked his dad, and his dad said, "Nope, don't want anything to do with him."
Wow. Even though he was writing the book, apparently, at that time.
There's this really interesting emotional conflict, it seems, between...
kind of an up and down thing, I'd say.
Being part of the story from the Beatles' perspective.
Interesting,
Yeah, he just said, I don't want anything to do with that anymore. And then a little while after that, so he, they had just some clips of him in there, but they were old news footage. So after that, this is really interesting, around 94 also. So another 10 years go by, and this Holland Beatles fan club guy flies to London and knocks on Howie's door, the son of Jimmie Nicol, and says, "Hey, we'd love for you and your dad to come back again this year. It's another anniversary, yada, yada." And Howie says, "Can't do that." And they're like, "Why?" And he said, "Because my dad has died." Bum, bum, bum.
What?
Okay.
So the mystery deepened. And so the story at that point was that Jimmy had died in 1994. And again, this is pre-internet and pre-cell phones, pre-everything. Things spread by word of mouth, by newsletters, all types of things. And as you know, there's a Beatle network around the whole world. Totally. And so things spread in a more old-fashioned way, but it spread through the world that Jimmie Nicol had died.
Sure, and if your son says you're dead...
Yeah, I
believe
mean,
he's
what's,
dead.
what's
you
a better
believe he's
source?
dead.
Yeah.
And I think that was a way to alleviate having to be asked to be involved as a Beatle anymore.
But he seemed to enjoy it, like when they went over, and it's
Yeah, it's
It's
I mean,
interesting.
I'm not a psychologist, but there's
No?
probably
What?
something to look into there
But your card
for
says-
you Beatle therapists out there.
But your card says Dr. Jim Berkenstadt, PhD,
He's the rock and roll
psychology.
detective, not the rock and roll therapist.
But
It's true.
I'm a juris doctor, but not
I see.
a psychologist. Anyway, so he didn't die at that time. He may be dead now. I
How
don't
do
know.
we know that? How do we
Well,
know that?
we
how
know
he was...
because I then continued to dig into his life, and I found a picture of him in 2004. Some paparazzi guy had found him, and of course he was much older, but he still had the same Beatle haircut, even though he's now 60 or something, and same teeth. Just everything about him was the same, other than he has a little more weight on him now and such.
Where did they find him?
They actually found him in London, an area called Camden.
Oh,
which
wow,
is
yeah.
northern.
It's not cheap to live in Camden. He must have some sort of...
Well, I went to his flat, as you will read in the last chapter.
Here we go.
Yeah, and
Amazing.
it was actually in an alley. It was the hardest place to find. I'm walking around and I'm using GPS. I don't know where this place is, and then I asked someone, and they said, "Oh, I think you go down that alley, and then turn right and go down another alley, and there's just this little apartment there."
Interesting. Well,
And
I guess...
when you knocked on the door...
When I knocked on the door, you'll have to read the book.
I knew that was coming.
So I know I'm not getting an answer to this question.
No,
but
you're not.
I gotta ask it anyway. Is he alive or dead? Bum bum.
Bum.
I think it's best to read the book to gather all of the circumstances surrounding his death or his life.
Well, spoken like a true historian.
Yeah.
Yes.
If I was a politician, I would pivot to another topic altogether.
Well, let's pivot to another topic, and let's pivot to the motion picture that this is going to be made into.
Right. That's very exciting. One day I got this cryptic call from a lawyer, and she said, "Have you sold the film rights to your book?" And I'd never really given that idea much thought, and I said, "No." She said, "Well, some very prominent people are interested in buying the film rights." And I said, "What are their names?" And she said, "I can't reveal my clients' names." And I said, "Well, then I can't sell my film rights." I said, "I need to meet these people, see if we get along." I said, "They got to see if they like me. We have to see if we have a similar vision of how this can be made into a movie. I think it would be a good idea for you to talk to your clients." I said, "I'm a lawyer. We don't have to be all secretive here. Let's just have a meeting on the phone." So that's what we did. And turned out that it was Alex Orbison, Roy Orbison's son, and Ashley Hamilton, who is George Hamilton's son, and Rod Stewart's ex-stepson. You can figure that one out.
Great.
Yeah. So we got on the phone and we had a terrific conversation. We hit it off. We're friends now. They're really nice guys. And they love the whole aspect of how do you deal with that 15 minutes of fame the rest of your life when you're only 25 or 26 years old, and what do you do and how do you do it? And the fact that he kept disappearing and walking away from one life and starting a new life somewhere else in the world each time was fascinating to them. And also they both have been in bands. In fact, Ashley Hamilton was like a big 90s star in Europe. And they both saw how fame is fleeting and how you can be up 1 minute or 1 year and then forgotten the next. You're only as good as your last hit, that sort of thing. And so they've always been fascinated by that aspect. And of course, Alex Orbison saw his dad, had this great early career, and then there was a dip, and then his career was revived. He was with the Traveling Wilburys. He had these great solo records with Jeff Lynne. The whole ebb and flow of fame and the idea of what do you do when you've just been to the very toppermost of the poppermost. And so they bought the rights from me, and then we made a deal with a film company called ECOS, British company, and the film is now what they call in development. So we're working on the script, and I'm helping the screenwriter.
So when do you think the movie's going to be out?
That's the big question. I would say the script's supposed to be done roughly by next spring. So after that, they have to hire, or maybe in the meantime, they'll hire a director and a casting director. But the script really tells you how to budget for the film, because you know how many scenes, where are they going to be, what locations can we do, you know, where can we save money. So there's a lot of budgeting going on after that. And then, okay, now that we know which characters are coming out of the book onto the screen, we need a woman, we need a man, we need 2 Jimmie Nicols, a young and an old. So, you know, they'll have to cast however many people come out of that script. And then once all that's set up and all those deals are signed, then they move on to the actual production. So it's hard to say. I don't think the film will be out next year, but it could be out in 2021.
What's your dream cast for the Jimmie Nicol biopic?
You know, I don't know that I really have a dream cast, because, you know, I think that it would be best anyway if it would be some young British actor, and I don't really know many British actors. I was hoping that this movie could be made when Salma Hayek was maybe 20 years younger, so that she could play Jimmy's Mexican wife, and then I would get to meet her. And then she, of course, would fall in love with me.
That sounds like a movie in your own mind.
Yes. Yes, indeed.
Well, we will definitely be talking to you again, and Selma, I hope, when the movie is getting closer to release.
Yeah, we'll both show up.
Fantastic.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
We'll let her in too.
If you're interested in a signed copy of the book, you can go to thebeatlewhovanished.com. If you don't need a signed copy, you can go to Amazon to find The Beatle Who Vanished.
What's up for you next?
Okay, well, I would say I've just finished a new book called Mysteries in the Music, Case Closed, where I pick about 8 or 9 stories that have always fascinated me, and I delve deeply into them again. I try to find eyewitnesses and things to the events who are still alive and solve these cases once and for all that were either real or hoaxes or conspiracies or myths.
How fun.
It's really a lot of fun. So one of the chapters I really enjoyed was, did the CIA assassinate Bob Marley? I was very fortunate to reach the people that I needed to reach in order to really get to the bottom of that story. So I'm doing that. I'm pitching a similar TV show in Hollywood right now that would be a rock and roll detective show. I think we want to make it sort of a more of an adult animated documentary program, but it'll delve into these similar stories and more.
Well, keep us updated. Let us know.
For real.
Yeah, I will.
And thank you so much for talking to us about Jimmie Nicol. And
I
guess I'll have to read your book to find out what happened to Jimmy.
All right, and we end our show as we always do with our latest Beatles obsession.
What is yours this episode?
As always, I'm on a Paul kick. I never not.
God, really?
Yeah, I like Paul. I like Paul a little. And coming up at the end of November, in just less than a month, is another record store day right after Thanksgiving. And Paul McCartney is going to be featured in Record Store Day this year, putting out 2 new songs, Home Tonight and In a Hurry. They were from the Egypt Station recording sessions, and they will be out on a 7-inch picture disc on November 29th, digital edition on November 22nd. So find your local record store, head out, and find this picture disc.
Yes, definitely. Support your indie record stores this Record Store Day. Very important.
And you can find everything that's happening for Record Store Day at recordstoreday.com. There are so many cool things coming out right now.
There are. I worked on some of them.
Oh, yeah?
I did. Yeah, we've got some cool stuff coming out as well. Of course, we don't have the Paul McCartney picture disc, but can't have everything, I suppose.
But I will have the Paul McCartney picture disc,
but
so all will be right in the world.
You know what's funny on that note is I discovered recently, because Paul kept advertising the Egypt Station Suitcase Edition, And I sort of just happenstance looked it up on Spotify and it's all there. And I was very excited because some of the bonus tracks I only heard once or twice when Egypt Station came out, but now they're all on Spotify. And I'm probably the last person to know that. But I was very excited.
If you cannot wait until the 29th of November, go listen to those Paul tracks if you hadn't heard them, because they're great.
Yes, so good.
What are you obsessed with right now?
So I am a huge, massive fan of non-English 60s pop music. Like, obviously, I love French pop. And a couple of years ago, I got into Cambodian pop, 60s pop. Yeah. And it's very interesting. There is a wonderful, wonderful documentary called Don't Think I've Forgotten that came out, I think, in 2015. And it goes through the story of Cambodian pop. So the scene there, it was very robust. Lots of cool things coming through by way of France, because Cambodia was a French territory until, I think, the 60s and 70s. So they were very influenced by French pop, which kind of explains why I sort of like the sound of the Cambodian 60s music. But it's very like psychedelic. There's lots of girl group kind of stuff. It's got a really distinct sound. The soundtrack to Don't Think I've Forgotten is on Spotify. There are also a couple of great comps if you want to check them out. One is called Cambodia Rocks, which was really the first Cambodian compilation from 1996. And there's another newer comp called Cambodian Nuggets that came out this year. But the thing with Cambodian pop, it makes it really precious, is that during the 1970s, there was the genocide committed by the Khmer Rouge when they came into power. And that was sort of the communist uprising in Cambodia. So the first thing they did was round up all the musicians. Oh. And a lot of them, we don't know what happened to them. We presume they were executed or sent to camps and died there. So like a lot of the artists you'll hear on the comps, they're mysteriously gone. They're like Jimmie Nicol. We don't know what happened to them, except we're pretty sure they, were murdered by the government, which is so tragic. And furthermore, the music's a real premium because a lot of that music was destroyed around that time. So what we have is really a small sliver of what there was. And I'm really hopeful that someday we'll unearth a huge treasure trove, but I'm sure all the masters, all of that is gone. Anyway, on that note, I love this Cambodian singer called Pen Ran. Sometimes she's called Pan Ron. Just depends on how anglicized her name is. I sort of like compare her to like a Ronnie Spector because they both got that amazing voice, got that bad girl flair. But she did a cover of A Hard Day's Night called, and I'm gonna butcher this, I'm so sorry, Pinhao Samniang, but it's by her and a guy called Corin Proy. I'm so sorry. Please correct me. I am awful at pronunciations. But she collaborated with a lot of people, including this guy called Sin Suthamoth, who was basically the Cambodian Elvis. They did a lot of collabs together, and he was really kind of the founding father of the Cambodian rock sound. So all these artists collaborated together. But this cover of A Hard Day's Night, which we'll post on our socials, it's so cool because it doesn't sound exactly on point. Like, I sort of spent half the song being like, I know this song. What is this song? But it's sort of like Hard Day's Night in a minor key. It's very cool. I love it. And I've been listening to it nonstop. This also gave me just a chance to talk about Cambodian 60s pop. So anyway, I'll step off my soapbox, but I love that cover.
That sounds so cool. I can't wait to hear that. Shout out to women singing Beatles songs. Awesome.
Hell yeah.
Yes.
Hell yeah. And, these badass women who are in the Cambodian music scene, there were so many of them who are just fabulous. Obviously, a lot of guys, too, a lot of garage bands. There's one great surf band. I can't remember the name at the moment. But again, check out Don't Think I've Forgotten. They talk to some of the surviving musicians. There are a couple of them. And the music is just unreal. If you haven't heard it, you're in for a real treat because it's fucking great.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I cannot wait.
Yeah. Check it out, brah.
We'll be posting it. But in the meantime, thank you for listening to BC the Beatles. And as always, please subscribe on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening right now, and give us a rating or review, preferably 5 stars, so other Beatlemaniacs can find us.
Yes, and please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We'll be posting photos and more from this episode and beyond. Remember, you can always email us at bcthebeatles@gmail.com too, and we'll see you next time.
Bye. Bye.